In the year 1912, German archaeologists working at the ancient site of Uruk made a discovery that would quietly challenge everything we thought we knew about the origins of civilization. In a temple archive, buried beneath centuries of accumulated sand and debris, they found thousands of clay tablets. But these weren't the administrative records or royal proclamations they'd expected. These were something far more puzzling. The tablets contained mathematical calculations of stunning sophistication, astronomical tables tracking Venus across decades, geometric formulas that wouldn't be rediscovered until Greek times, numerical systems designed for calculations we can barely imagine ancient peoples needing. And the dating was unmistakable. These tablets came from Sumer's earliest period, from the very dawn of writing itself. Around 3200 BCE, this posed an immediate problem. Mathematics doesn't spring fully formed into existence. It develops gradually over generations as cultures solve progressively more complex problems. You start with counting sheep. Eventually, centuries later, you reach advanced astronomy. That's how it should work. That's how we assumed it had worked. But the Sumerian tablets showed something different. They showed advanced mathematics appearing at the same moment as writing itself, as if the knowledge already existed and simply needed to be written down, as if someone already knew these things and was recording what they'd always known, not discovering it for the first time. Tonight, we explore a possibility that makes historians uncomfortable, but that the evidence keeps suggesting. What if Sumer's first kings weren't the beginning of civilization at all, but the continuation of something older? What if they were survivors of a forgotten age, bearers of knowledge from before the flood, teachers who arrived in Mesopotamia carrying the wisdom of a world that no longer existed? The clay tablets rest in museums now, bearing their impossible sophistication. The cities of those first kings lie in ruins beneath the Iraqi desert. But the question remains, pressed into those ancient calculations like fingerprints from vanished hands. Where did this knowledge come from? And who brought it to the land between the rivers when the world was supposedly still learning to farm? Our story begins not with answers, but with the deepest mystery, the civilization that appeared too perfect, too complete, too knowledgeable to have been born in the moment we found it. Civilization arrives fully formed. The standard narrative of human civilization goes something like this. Humans spent hundreds of thousands of years as hunter-gatherers, living in small mobile bands, following game, gathering plants, slowly developing language and culture. Then, around 10,000 BCE, the ice sheets retreated, the climate warmed, and the Neolithic Revolution began. Humans learned to domesticate plants and animals. They settled into villages. Population grew. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. Social complexity increased. Specialization emerged. Writing was invented to track increasingly complex transactions. Civilization was born. It's a gradual story. A story of slow accumulation, of trial and error, of incremental innovation across centuries and millennia. This is what we see in most places. In China, in Mesoamerica, in the Andes, there are clear developmental sequences. We can trace the progression from simple to complex, from village to city, from basic to sophisticated. But Sumer doesn't quite fit this pattern, and the more closely archaeologists examine the evidence, the more puzzling it becomes. Around 3500 BCE, In the flat alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers meet the Persian Gulf, cities suddenly appear. Not villages growing into towns, growing into cities over centuries. Cities. Uruk, the world's first true metropolis, appears in the archaeological record as a fully functioning urban center with tens of thousands of inhabitants. Massive public architecture, complex administration, and, most remarkably, writing. The Ubaid period, which preceded the Uruk period, shows settled agricultural communities from about 6,500 to 3,800 BCE. These villages had pottery, basic architecture, some irrigation. They were successful farming settlements, but they were relatively simple. Small populations, no monumental buildings, no apparent social stratification, no writing, standard Neolithic culture, similar to what was developing in many parts of the world at that time. Then, around 3500 BCE, everything changes. Within a few centuries, a blink of an eye in archaeological time, we see the emergence of massive cities, temple complexes on artificial platforms, sophisticated irrigation systems spanning hundreds of miles, craft specialization, long-distance trade networks, social hierarchies, bureaucratic administration, and a fully developed writing system. This rapid transformation is called the Urban Revolution, and it happened in Sumer faster and more completely than anywhere else in the ancient world. The question that has puzzled archaeologists for over a century is, why? What caused this sudden explosion of complexity? The conventional answer is that it was a natural progression. The Ubaid villagers gradually figured out irrigation through experimentation, and by the Uruk period had accumulated enough knowledge to build large-scale systems. This is possible. People are innovative. Trial and error works. But there's another pattern in the evidence that the conventional narrative struggles to explain. The knowledge doesn't seem to develop. It seems to arrive. When we look at Egyptian civilization, which emerged slightly later than Sumer, we see a similar pattern. Around 3100 BCE, we have a unified kingdom with monumental architecture, hieroglyphic writing, sophisticated art, complex theology, and centralized administration. The Great Pyramids of Giza, built around 2500 BCE, display engineering and mathematical knowledge far beyond what a 600-year-old civilization should possess. For most of history, the answer was straightforward. The gods gave it. Sumerian texts explicitly state that the gods taught humanity the arts of civilization. Egyptian texts credit Thoth with giving writing and knowledge to humans. Greek tradition remembered Prometheus stealing fire from the gods to give to humanity. Modern scholars naturally reject the literal divine explanation, but that leaves the question open. If not gods, then who or what? One possibility, rarely discussed in mainstream archaeology but worth considering, is that the knowledge was transmitted by humans, but not by the local populations who became Sumerians and Egyptians, by others, by people who already possessed sophisticated knowledge, who came to these river valleys after some catastrophe had destroyed their own civilizations, and who taught the locals what they knew. Survivors, teachers, the civilizing heroes that nearly every ancient culture claims, brought them knowledge in the distant past. What if, at the end of the last ice age, there were human cultures more sophisticated than we've assumed? What if the Younger Dryas catastrophe around 12,900 years ago destroyed these cultures? What if survivors carried their knowledge to refugia like Mesopotamia and Egypt, and gradually transmitted that knowledge to the Neolithic peoples they found there? This would explain the sudden appearance of sophisticated systems. It would explain why writing, mathematics, and monumental architecture seem to arrive fully formed rather than developing gradually. It would explain the ancient traditions of divine teachers. And it would explain the Sumerian king list's insistence that kingship descended from heaven to Eridu, if heaven is metaphorical for elsewhere, from people who came from outside, from before. The Advanced Knowledge Problem. The Sumerian Base 60 mathematical system isn't just elegant, it's perfectly designed for astronomy and complex calculations. When you want to track celestial movements, divide circles into degrees, calculate time, or work with fractions in a pre-calculator world, Base 60 is ideal. It's as if the number system was designed by people who already knew they needed to do these things. The astronomical observations recorded in the earliest tablets are remarkably accurate. Venus tablets from the Old Babylonian period track Venus across decades with precision. The Sumerians knew things about Venus that required decades of careful observation to discover. They knew that Venus completes 5 cycles relative to Earth's position every 8 years, a pattern that requires at least 16 years of continuous observation to identify reliably. They knew the length of the Venus year, 225 Earth days, with remarkable accuracy. This knowledge appears in Sumerian texts from the earliest period, already known, already being used for calculations, as if the observers already knew what to look for. The same pattern appears with lunar astronomy. The Sumerians had a sophisticated lunar calendar that required understanding the complex relationship between lunar months, 29.5 days, and solar years, 365.25 days. They developed intercalation systems. But here's what's remarkable. Early Sumerian calendars are already intercalated. The problem was already solved before we have records of it being studied. Some scholars argue that Sumerian astronomical texts show awareness of precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of stars to shift over thousands of years. Precession takes about 26,000 years to complete a full cycle. You can't observe it in a single lifetime or even a single civilization's lifespan. You can only know about it if you have records spanning thousands of years, or if someone taught you about it. The Sumerians' medical knowledge was similarly advanced. Clay tablets record surgical procedures, pharmaceutical recipes using dozens of plants and minerals, understanding of anatomy and physiology. This medical knowledge appears suddenly in the written record, already sophisticated. Their legal system is another example. Sumerian legal codes, dating back to around 2100 BCE, are already sophisticated. They show understanding of property rights, contract law, criminal justice, liability, compensation. They distinguish between intentional and accidental harm. This legal thinking requires philosophical sophistication and generations of legal practice to develop. Yet Sumerian law appears in the written record already mature. The pattern repeats across every domain: mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, architecture, irrigation engineering. In each case, sophisticated knowledge appears early, seemingly without the long developmental period we'd expect. The conventional explanation is that this knowledge did develop gradually during the Ubaid period and earlier, but we simply don't have records of it, because writing didn't exist yet. The knowledge was transmitted orally and through practice, and when writing was finally invented, people wrote down what they already knew. This is plausible. Oral transmission can preserve sophisticated knowledge. Many pre-literate cultures have complex astronomical, mathematical, and medical knowledge transmitted orally across generations. But there's a third possibility. The knowledge was brought by people who already had it, people from a culture that had already developed mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and medicine. People who came to Mesopotamia as refugees or migrants, and who taught what they knew to the Neolithic communities they encountered. The kings with strange names. The Sumerian king list provides intriguing clues. While the antediluvian kings have impossibly long reigns, the early post-flood kings are described in ways that suggest they possessed special knowledge or abilities. Consider Etana, an early king of Kish after the flood. Later, Mesopotamian literature gives us more detail. He's described as the shepherd who ascended to heaven. The Epoch of Etana tells his story. His wife was unable to bear children. To solve this problem, Etana needed the plant of birth, which grew only in heaven. With the help of an eagle, Etana ascended to heaven, retrieved the plant, and returned to earth. His wife bore a son, and the dynasty continued. This is mythology. But like all mythology, it may encode historical memory. What might ascending to heaven represent? In a pre-scientific world, how would you describe someone with advanced knowledge? Someone who understood medicine and could solve an infertility problem that seemed hopeless. The plant of birth could represent actual botanical knowledge. Many plants have effects on fertility. Some enhance it, some inhibit it. A person with sophisticated pharmacological knowledge would know which plants to use for various reproductive issues. To a population without this knowledge, such a person would seem to have access to supernatural wisdom. Etana is called the shepherd. This connects him to a pastoral tradition, to people who herded animals rather than farming. The highlands of Anatolia and the Zagros Mountains, regions north and east of Mesopotamia, were home to pastoral peoples during the Neolithic period. These peoples had different knowledge than lowland farmers. They understood animal husbandry, seasonal migration, mountain environments. If Etana represented a lineage of people from the highlands who came to Mesopotamia after some disruption, his title, the shepherd, would make sense. And if these highland people had preserved knowledge from earlier times, knowledge that lowland farmers lacked, his role as knowledge-bearer would also make sense. Then there's Enmerkar, king of Uruk in the first dynasty of that city. Sumerian literature credits Enmerkar with several significant achievements. He's said to have built the great temples of Uruk, including the Eanna temple complex dedicated to the goddess Inanna. He's credited with establishing trade relations with distant lands, particularly Harata, a semi-mythical city possibly located in the Iranian highlands. Most intriguingly, one version of Enmerkar's story suggests he invented writing. The text describes a message too complex to memorize, so Enmerkar inscribed it in clay, creating the first written document. While this is certainly legendary rather than historically accurate, writing developed gradually, not through single invention. It connects Enmerkar with the transition to literacy. It suggests his reign was associated with a major advancement in record-keeping and communication. If we interpret this generously, it might preserve memory of a time when writing became systematized, when what had been limited pictographic notation became a full writing system. And it associates this development with a specific royal lineage, suggesting that this knowledge came from the ruling class, not from the general population. Then we come to Gilgamesh, perhaps the most famous of ancient Mesopotamian kings. Historical records confirm that a king named Gilgamesh ruled Uruk around 2700 BCE, making him one of the earliest historically verifiable Mesopotamian rulers. The king list gives him a reign of 126 years, still impossible, but far more modest than earlier figures. But it's the Epic of Gilgamesh, written down centuries after his death but preserving older oral traditions, that tells us something significant. The Epic describes Gilgamesh as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. In a literal reading, this is mythology. But what might it represent symbolically? If divine means possessing special knowledge, and human means ordinary, then 2/3 divine might mean mostly from the knowledge-bearing class. It might indicate that Gilgamesh represented a lineage that had largely preserved ancient wisdom, with some intermixing with the ordinary population. The epic's plot is revealing. After his friend Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh becomes obsessed with finding immortality. He journeys to meet Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood, who has been granted eternal life. Gilgamesh wants to learn the secret of immortality, which is to say, he wants to access the knowledge of the pre-flood world. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh that immortality isn't available to humans of the current age. That secret belongs to the past, to the time before the flood. The message of the epic is that the knowledge of the antediluvian world is largely lost. Some of it survived through figures like Utnapishtim, but it can't be fully recovered. The current age must make do with the fragments that remain. If we read this as encoding historical memory, it suggests that the Mesopotamians believed they had lost knowledge, that their ancestors or predecessors knew things that were no longer fully accessible, and it connects this lost knowledge specifically to the pre-flood period. The names of these early kings are also telling. Many contain elements meaning heaven and Ana, or Lord, En. These names emphasize divine connections, lordship, and ancient lineage. In the context of the survivor theory, these names make sense. If the early kings represented lineages that had preserved knowledge from an earlier civilization, their names would emphasize their special status, their connection to heaven, perhaps meaning the highlands, or simply from elsewhere. Later, Mesopotamian tradition explicitly states that the early kings possessed knowledge from before the flood. Texts describe how the antediluvian sages, the Apkallu, taught the arts of civilization before the flood, and how post-flood kings maintained this knowledge. The Sumerians didn't see themselves as inventors starting from scratch. They saw themselves as inheritors, as preservers of wisdom from an earlier time. Whether this was literally true or metaphorically expressed cultural memory, it shaped how they understood their own civilization. The civilizing heroes. Motive. The most striking thing about the survivor theory is how universal the pattern is. The Sumerians weren't unique in claiming their civilization was taught to them by others. Nearly every ancient culture has stories of civilizing heroes, divine or semi-divine beings who came from elsewhere and taught humanity the arts of civilization. In Mesopotamian tradition, as recorded by Berossus in the 3rd century BCE, there was Oannes. Berossus describes Oannes as an amphibious being who emerged from the Persian Gulf during the reign of the first king. Oannes taught the people of Mesopotamia how to construct cities, temples, and canals. He taught them writing, mathematics, agriculture, and law. Then, at sunset, he would return to the sea. The fish-human form is symbolic, not literal, but the core narrative is clear. Civilization was taught by someone from outside the local population, someone who came from the sea. The knowledge didn't develop locally. It was transmitted by a teacher who then departed. Berossus also mentions 7 sages, the Apkallu, who taught before the flood, and then 4 post-flood sages who continued the tradition. These sages were the source of Mesopotamian wisdom. In Egyptian tradition, the god Thoth played a similar role. Thoth was the god of writing, mathematics, astronomy, and magic. He was credited with inventing hieroglyphic writing and giving it to humanity. In some traditions, Thoth was not originally Egyptian but came from elsewhere to bring knowledge to the Nile Valley. Egyptian texts also mention the Shemsu-Hor, the followers of Horus, who ruled Egypt before the historical pharaohs. These semi-divine beings supposedly reigned for thousands of years and established the foundations of Egyptian civilization, giving them impossibly long reigns similar to the Sumerian antediluvian kings. In Greek mythology, Prometheus is the titan who stole fire from Zeus and gave it to humanity. Fire here represents not just literal flames, but technology, knowledge, the ability to transform the world. The Greek tradition also preserves stories of various heroes and demigods who taught specific arts. Orpheus taught music and poetry. Asclepius taught medicine. Daedalus taught craftsmanship and invention. Each represents the transmission of specialized knowledge from divine or semi-divine sources to ordinary humans. In Mesoamerica, the Aztecs had Quetzalcoatl, and the Maya had Kukulkan, both names meaning feathered serpent. These were described as bearded, light-skinned civilizing heroes who came from across the sea, taught the people agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, and writing, and then departed with promises to return. In South America, the Inca tradition speaks of Viracocha, often depicted as a bearded white man who taught civilization to the Andean peoples after a great flood had destroyed the previous world. In Hindu tradition, the Matsya Purana tells of Matsya, the fish avatar of Vishnu, who warned Manu about the coming flood and helped him save humanity and the Vedas. After the flood, Matsya ensured that knowledge was preserved and transmitted to the New Age. Chinese mythology has similar figures, divine or semi-divine culture heroes who taught agriculture, writing, medicine, and social organization. Even in the Pacific Islands, traditions speak of knowledge-bearing ancestors who arrived by sea, bringing skills in navigation, astronomy, and agriculture from a sunken homeland. The pattern is remarkably consistent across unconnected cultures. 1. Civilization's knowledge was taught, not invented locally. 2. The teachers came from elsewhere, across water, from mountains, from the sky. 3. The teachers were described as divine, semi-divine, or somehow superior. 4. The teaching often followed a catastrophe, usually a flood. 5. The teachers eventually departed, leaving humanity to continue with the transmitted knowledge. Conventional scholarship explains this pattern as a mythological expression of cultural change. When a culture develops agriculture, they create a story about a hero who taught agriculture. When writing is invented, they credit a legendary figure. This explanation works for some aspects. Cultures do mythologize their own innovations, but it struggles to explain the specificity and consistency of the pattern. Why do so many unconnected cultures describe their teachers as coming from across water? Why is the teaching so often connected to a flood catastrophe? Why do the teachers depart rather than staying to rule? If we take the traditions at face value, not literally, but as encoding genuine historical memory, they suggest something more specific, that there were people with advanced knowledge who migrated to various regions after some catastrophe, taught what they knew, and then either died out or were absorbed into the local populations, leaving only the memory of their teaching. The flood that changed the world. The flood appears in nearly every ancient tradition. The biblical flood is the most famous in Western culture, but it's hardly unique. Mesopotamian flood narratives predate the biblical account by over 1,000 years. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains a detailed flood story. Utnapishtim, the immortal flood survivor, describes how the gods decided to destroy humanity with a flood. But one god, Ea, warned Utnapishtim and instructed him to build a boat. Utnapishtim built the boat, loaded it with his family and animals, and survived the deluge. When the waters receded, the gods granted him immortality. The biblical account in Genesis is clearly part of this same tradition, adapted to monotheism, but preserving the same narrative structure and many of the same details. But the flood story isn't limited to the Near East. Hindu tradition preserves the story of Manu and the fish. Greek mythology includes the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha surviving a flood sent by Zeus. Native American traditions across both continents contain flood narratives. Australian Aboriginal traditions speak of a great flood. Pacific Island cultures remember a flood that destroyed the previous world. The near universality of flood traditions has long puzzled scholars. Some suggest they reflect local flooding events, rivers overflowing, coastal inundation that got mythologized into a world-destroying deluge. Others suggest the flood is a metaphor for social upheaval or the transition to agriculture. But there's another possibility, that the flood traditions preserve memory of an actual catastrophic event that affected large portions of the inhabited world at the end of the last ice age. Around 11,600 years ago, the Younger Dryas cold period ended abruptly. Over just a few decades, global temperatures rose dramatically. The massive ice sheets covering North America and Europe began to melt. Sea levels rose by over 300 feet. Coastlines that had been inhabited for thousands of years were inundated. River valleys flooded. Climate patterns shifted dramatically. This wasn't just ordinary climate change. It was catastrophic. Entire landscapes were transformed. Populations that had lived in coastal regions for generations were displaced. The warming triggered massive flooding as ice dams broke and meltwater rushed to the sea. Evidence for the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests that the trigger may have been a comet or asteroid impact around 12,900 years ago. While this hypothesis remains controversial, it would explain the abrupt onset of the Younger Dryas and the equally abrupt warming that followed. If there were relatively sophisticated human cultures living in coastal regions and river valleys at the end of the Ice Age, cultures we've lost evidence of because their settlements are now underwater, then the Younger Dryas catastrophe and the subsequent flooding would have destroyed them. Survivors from these cultures would have fled to highland refugia, places like the mountains of Anatolia, the Zagros, the Iranian plateau. And when conditions stabilized, some of these survivors might have descended to the newly habitable river valleys of Mesopotamia and Egypt, bringing with them whatever knowledge they had preserved. This would explain several puzzles. Why advanced knowledge appears suddenly in Mesopotamia and Egypt without visible local development. Why flood traditions are so widespread and so specific in their details. Why ancient peoples consistently claimed their knowledge came from before the flood. Why the civilizing heroes are described as coming from elsewhere, often across water. Why these heroes taught rather than ruled. They were refugees, not conquerors. The hypothesis is speculative. We don't have direct evidence of these lost Ice Age cultures. But the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Most of the coastlines where these cultures would have lived are now 300 feet underwater. We've barely explored these submerged landscapes. Göbekli Tepe, Rewriting Prehistory. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt began excavating a site in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. What he found challenged fundamental assumptions about human prehistory. Göbekli Tepe is a massive complex of megalithic structures, circular enclosures defined by enormous T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons. The pillars are decorated with intricate carvings of animals: lions, bulls, foxes, snakes, scorpions, birds. The sophistication of the architecture and art is remarkable. But what's truly revolutionary is the dating. Göbekli Tepe was built around 9600 BCE, over 11,000 years ago. This is before agriculture, before pottery, before settled villages, as we understood them. According to conventional models, hunter-gatherers didn't build monumental architecture. They didn't have the social organization or the surplus food production required. Complex society was supposed to develop after agriculture, not before. Göbekli Tepe demolishes that assumption. Here we have sophisticated architecture, symbolic art, and evidence of large-scale social organization among people who were still hunting and gathering. The site required enormous labor. Moving and erecting the pillars would have required hundreds of people working in coordinated fashion. The carvings show artistic skill and symbolic thinking. The careful astronomical alignments suggest sophisticated observation of the sky. Who built Göbekli Tepe? Not primitive hunter-gatherers stumbling toward agriculture. These were people with knowledge, organization, and artistic sophistication that we hadn't expected in the pre-agricultural world. And here's what's most intriguing. Göbekli Tepe was built around 9600 BCE, just as the Younger Dryas was ending and the climate was warming. If the survivor theory has any validity, this is exactly when and where we'd expect to find evidence of sophisticated refugees from the Ice Age catastrophe. The location is significant. Göbekli Tepe sits in southeastern Turkey, in the northern reaches of the Fertile Crescent, not far from the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates. This is highland territory, exactly where survivors from flooded lowlands might have fled. And Göbekli Tepe isn't alone. Nearby sites like Karahan Tepe and Nivali Chori show similar sophistication and similar dating. There's a whole complex of pre-agricultural monumental architecture in this region. What happened to these people? Around 8000 BCE, Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. The enclosures were carefully filled in with debris and soil, preserving them perfectly but ending their use. Why? Perhaps because the people were moving. As the climate stabilized and the river valleys to the south became habitable, perhaps the descendants of the Göbekli Tepe builders migrated south to Mesopotamia, bringing their knowledge with them. This would explain the sudden appearance of sophisticated culture in Sumer. The knowledge didn't develop in Mesopotamia. It arrived from the north, carried by people who had already achieved remarkable things at sites like Göbekli Tepe. The 7 sages who taught before the flood. Mesopotamian tradition is explicit about the source of their civilization. It was taught by the Apkallu, 7 sages who lived before the flood. The Apkallu are described in texts spanning thousands of years. They're depicted in art as figures wearing fish cloaks, not because they were literally fishmen, but because they came from or across the water. The fish symbolism represents their aquatic origin or arrival. According to the tradition, the first Apkallu was Adapa, also called Uan or Oannes in later Greek accounts. Adapa was exceptionally wise, possessing knowledge of all things. He was the one who revealed the designs for temples, who revealed the pure rites, who taught humanity the crafts of civilization. The other 6 Apkallu followed, each bringing additional knowledge. They taught mathematics, astronomy, architecture, irrigation, law, medicine, and the arts. They established the foundations of Mesopotamian civilization before the flood destroyed the world. After the flood, 4 Apkallu appeared to continue the teaching, though they were described as less powerful than their antediluvian predecessors. The post-flood kings were then responsible for maintaining and transmitting the knowledge the Apkallu had taught. This is obviously mythological in its details. But what if it encodes historical memory? What if the Apkallu were not supernatural beings, but actual people, survivors from a more sophisticated culture who came to Mesopotamia and taught what they knew? The fish imagery might represent that they came by boat, across the Persian Gulf, or down the rivers. The description of them as sages rather than kings suggests they were teachers, not rulers. The claim that they came before the flood would make sense if they were refugees from a culture destroyed by the catastrophic flooding at the end of the Ice Age. The tradition explicitly states that civilization was taught, not invented. The Apkallu didn't help humans develop knowledge. They transmitted knowledge that already existed. This is precisely what we'd expect if they were survivors from an earlier, sophisticated culture. The number 7 appears in civilizing hero traditions across cultures. 7 sages, 7 wise men, 7 founders. This suggests a memory not of individual figures but of a group. Perhaps a succession of teachers over generations, or perhaps a founding group that came together. What's particularly interesting is that the Mesopotamian texts distinguish between the antediluvian and post-diluvian Apkallu. The earlier ones are described as more powerful, possessing greater knowledge. This makes sense if the earlier sages were closer to the original sophisticated culture, while later teachers were working with increasingly fragmentary knowledge. The texts also mention that some knowledge was deliberately hidden or lost. After the flood, certain wisdom was said to be taken up to heaven or hidden in Eridu. This suggests that not all knowledge could be transmitted, that some was lost in the catastrophe or deliberately protected. Eridu, where kingship descended from heaven. The Sumerian king list states that kingship descended from heaven to Eridu, making it the first city. Archaeological evidence confirms that Eridu is indeed one of the oldest Sumerian settlements, with occupation going back to around 5400 BCE. But Eridu holds a special place in Mesopotamian tradition beyond just being old. It was considered the most sacred of cities, the primordial city, the place where civilization began. The temple of Enki at Eridu was believed to stand on the spot where creation occurred, where the Apsu, the sweet water abyss, met the earth. Enki, the god associated with Eridu, was the god of wisdom, crafts, and magic. He was the one who warned Utnapishtim, Ziusudra, about the coming flood. He was the keeper of the Mi, the divine decrees that governed civilization. He was, in effect, the divine embodiment of the knowledge that the Apkallu taught. If Eridu was where kingship descended from heaven, and if we interpret heaven as elsewhere, or from the highlands, then Eridu might have been where the knowledge-barren refugees first settled when they came down from the post-Ice Age refugia in the mountains to the north. The location is significant. Eridu sits at the southern edge of Mesopotamia, near where the Tigris and Euphrates would have met the Persian Gulf in ancient times. This is exactly where you'd expect knowledge-bearing people coming from the sea to make landfall. Archaeological evidence shows that Eridu had a temple from its earliest levels, not a simple shrine, but a substantial structure that was repeatedly rebuilt on the same spot over millennia, each iteration larger and more sophisticated than the last. This suggests that Eridu was a ritual center, a place of special significance from the very beginning. Why would a newly founded settlement immediately build a temple? Unless the founders already had a tradition of temple building, already understood the importance of sacred architecture, already possessed the knowledge needed to create such structures. The successive rebuilding of the temple shows continuity of purpose over thousands of years. The people of Eridu weren't experimenting with architecture. They were maintaining a tradition, preserving a practice that had meaning from the start. The kings who lived for thousands of years. The Sumerian king list records that before the flood, 5 cities had kingship, and 8 kings ruled for a total of 241,200 years. These numbers are obviously impossible for individual human lifespans, but what might they represent? One interpretation is that these aren't individual kings, but dynasties or lineages. The reign of Alulim of Eridu for 28,800 years might represent the Alulim dynasty, a line of rulers who held power for many generations. But there's another intriguing possibility. The numbers might be using a different counting system or time scale than we're assuming. Some scholars have noted that if you divide the antediluvian reign lengths by 60, the Sumerian base 60 system, you get more plausible numbers. But even if we can't decode the exact meaning of the numbers, The King List preserves important information. It distinguishes between antediluvian and post-diluvian rulers. It places the flood as a definitive break in history. It identifies Eridu as the first city. It names specific individuals and dynasties. Most importantly, it claims that kingship, which is to say organized rule, and, by extension, civilization, existed before the flood. This is the key claim. Civilization didn't begin after the flood. It existed before and continued after, though the flood represented a catastrophic disruption. Comparing flood narratives across cultures. When we compare flood narratives from different cultures, the similarities are striking. Mesopotamian, biblical, Hindu, and Greek flood stories all share specific narrative elements: divine warning, boat construction, saving of family and animals, universal destruction, landing on mountain, sacrifice after flood. The pattern repeats globally with remarkable consistency. These aren't just generic big water stories. They share specific details that demand explanation beyond coincidence or independent invention. The conventional explanation that these stories spread through cultural contact works for some regions but doesn't explain the worldwide distribution. The alternative, that all cultures experienced local flooding and created similar stories, doesn't explain the shared specific details or the global nature of the catastrophe described. The third explanation is that these stories preserve memory of actual catastrophic flooding at the end of the last ice age. People living in coastal regions and river valleys worldwide would have experienced catastrophic flooding as sea levels rose 300+ feet. Survivors would have passed down stories of the deluge. The Younger Dryas, a world in crisis. Around 12,900 years ago, the Earth was warming after the last ice age. Then, suddenly, temperatures plummeted. The Younger Dryas cold period began abruptly, returning ice age conditions for over 1,000 years. Evidence suggests a comet or asteroid impact may have triggered the cooling. Around 11,600 years ago, the climate warmed rapidly, even more abruptly than the cooling had occurred. This rapid warming triggered massive changes: ice sheet melting, sea level rise of over 300 feet, coastline inundation, river system changes, climate pattern shifts, ecosystem transformation. For human populations, this would have been catastrophic. Coastal settlements that had been stable for generations would have been gradually, then rapidly inundated. The old homeland would have disappeared beneath the waves. If sophisticated cultures existed in coastal regions, and there's no reason to think they didn't, their settlements and monuments would now be submerged. We've barely begun to explore these underwater landscapes. What we haven't found yet. The absence of evidence for sophisticated Ice Age cultures has traditionally been taken as evidence of absence. But this reasoning has a fundamental flaw. We're not looking in the right places. Most archaeology focuses on dry land, on sites that were located in the same places 10,000+ years ago that are still land today. Coastal sites from the Ice Age are now underwater. River valley settlements are either underwater or buried under massive alluvial sediment. The places where sophisticated cultures would most likely have developed, near water, in temperate zones, with access to diverse resources, are precisely the places we can't easily investigate. At the end of the Ice Age, the optimal settlement locations were different than today. Sea level was 300+ feet lower. The coastlines were miles seaward from present coasts. What we now think of as optimal settlement locations may have been interior, less desirable sites 12,000 years ago. If sophisticated Ice Age cultures existed, they would have been located where conditions were best, on what are now submerged coastal plains. Their settlements, monuments, and harbors would be underwater. Some underwater investigations have found intriguing evidence, but systematic survey is limited. Without comprehensive exploration, we can't know what's there. The point isn't that any specific underwater site proves advanced Ice Age civilization. The point is that the optimal locations for Ice Age settlement are now underwater, and we've barely looked there. Putting the pieces together. Let's synthesize what we've explored. The evidence. 1. Sumerian civilization appears suddenly with sophisticated knowledge. 2. This knowledge appears fully formed without visible gradual development. 3. The Sumerians claimed their knowledge came from before the flood. 4. They claimed it was taught by sages from an earlier age. 5. Similar patterns appear in Egypt and other early civilizations. 6. Universal traditions of civilizing heroes teaching humanity. 7. Widespread flood narratives with specific shared details. 8. Geological evidence for catastrophic flooding at the Ice Age end. 9. Pre-agricultural sophistication at sites like Göbekli Tepe 10. Optimal Ice Age settlement locations now underwater. The conventional explanation. Knowledge developed gradually during pre-literate periods and was recorded when writing was invented. The sophistication isn't anomalous. Oral tradition can preserve complex knowledge. Flood myths reflect local flooding mythologized over time. Civilizing hero traditions are metaphors for cultural development. The survivor theory. At the Ice Age end, sophisticated human cultures existed in coastal regions and river valleys. The Younger Dryas catastrophe and subsequent rapid warming destroyed these cultures. Survivors, carrying preserved knowledge, fled to highland refugia. When conditions stabilized, some descendants migrated to regions like Mesopotamia and Egypt, where they taught local Neolithic populations. This transmitted knowledge explains the sudden appearance of sophistication. Which explanation fits better? The conventional explanation requires believing that complex knowledge in multiple domains developed simultaneously during pre-literate periods across Mesopotamia. None of this development left archaeological traces. Writing was invented precisely when all this knowledge reached maturity, and similar patterns elsewhere are coincidental. The survivor theory requires believing that human cultures at the Ice Age end were more sophisticated than usually assumed. These cultures were destroyed by documented catastrophic climate change and flooding. Survivors transmitted knowledge to later populations, and ancient traditions preserve memory of this transmission. Neither explanation is proven. But the survivor theory has the advantage of taking ancient peoples at their word about their own history. It explains the sudden appearance of knowledge. It fits the geological evidence of catastrophic flooding. It accounts for universal patterns in flood myths and civilizing hero traditions. The implications. If the survivor theory has even partial validity, it means 1. Human civilization is older than we've believed, not in Mesopotamia specifically, but in terms of sophisticated knowledge existing before the Neolithic too. Catastrophic climate change has destroyed evidence of earlier human achievements. 3. What we call the first civilizations may be better understood as the first post-catastrophe civilizations. 4. Ancient traditions deserve more respect as potentially encoding historical memory. 5. Significant archaeological evidence may exist underwater, waiting to be found. Who we don't know. Even if the survivor theory is correct, many questions remain. How sophisticated were the Ice Age cultures? How many survived the catastrophe? How was knowledge transmitted? Why did it take thousands of years after the catastrophe for civilizations like Sumer to emerge? Are there specific underwater sites that could provide evidence? The mystery remains. The clay tablets still rest in museums, bearing their impossible sophistication. The ruins of Uruk, Eridu, and other ancient cities still rise from the Iraqi desert. The king list still names the antediluvian kings and their impossible reigns. We're left with a choice: dismiss ancient testimony and assume gradual, invisible development of all knowledge, or take seriously the possibility that Sumer's first kings were indeed the last survivors of a forgotten age, bearers of knowledge from before the flood, teachers who arrived carrying the wisdom of a world that no longer existed. The evidence doesn't prove the survivor theory, but it doesn't disprove it either. And the more we learn about late Ice Age human capabilities, catastrophic climate change, and submerged landscapes, the more plausible the theory becomes. Perhaps Gilgamesh's quest to find Utnapishtim and learn the secrets of the pre-flood world represents more than mythology. Perhaps it represents what we're all trying to do: understand where our knowledge came from and what was lost along the way. The answer may lie underwater, off ancient coastlines, in the ruins of settlements that sank beneath the waves when the Ice Age ended. Or it may lie in taking another look at what we've already found: the tablets, the king lists, the traditions, and asking whether they might be telling us something true about a forgotten chapter of human history. What if Sumer's first kings really were the last survivors of a forgotten age? What if the impossible sophistication, the strange names, the flood stories, and the civilizing heroes all point to the same truth: that civilization is older and more resilient than we knew, and that even when the world ends, knowledge finds a way to survive? The question remains, pressed into the clay like fingerprints from vanished hands. And perhaps that's exactly what they are. The survivor theory remains speculative, but increasingly worth serious consideration as our understanding of Ice Age human capabilities expands, as evidence for catastrophic climate events accumulates, and as underwater archaeology begins revealing what lies beneath ancient seas. The question isn't whether advanced knowledge appeared in Mesopotamia. It clearly did. The question is where that knowledge came from, and the ancient people's own answer, that it came from teachers, from before the flood, from elsewhere, deserves to be taken seriously as a hypothesis, not dismissed as mere mythology. The tablets speak, the ruins testify, the traditions remember. Perhaps it's time we started listening, not with blind faith, but with the same openness to evidence and willingness to reconsider assumptions that drives scientific progress. The survivors of that forgotten age, if they existed, left their mark in the knowledge they transmitted, in the cities they helped found, in the traditions that preserved their teaching, and, perhaps most literally, in the fingerprints pressed into those ancient tablets. Whether we choose to see them as metaphorical or literal, they remain, enduring questions pressed into clay, waiting for answers that archaeology, geology, and perhaps underwater exploration may one day provide. Until then, the mystery endures, magnificent in its scope, humbling in its implications, and perhaps telling us something profound about human resilience and the stubborn persistence of knowledge across even the most catastrophic disruptions. The clay tablets remain, bearing witness. The ancient cities endure, silent testimony. The traditions persist, carrying memories forward. And we, inheritors of whatever happened in that distant past, continue seeking, questioning, and wondering about the hands that left those marks, the minds that possessed that knowledge, and the world they once knew that disappeared beneath the floods. This is the story we can tell from the evidence we have. Whether it's the whole truth, part of the truth, or something more complex, it's a story worth telling, a possibility worth exploring, a hypothesis worth testing. And in that spirit of inquiry, we continue, examining the evidence, questioning our assumptions, and listening to what the ancients themselves tried to tell us, in tablets pressed with careful hands, in kings' lists preserving impossible chronologies, in flood stories passed down through countless generations, and in monuments built to endure. The quest for understanding continues. The mystery, for now, remains beautifully unsolved, a testament to the depth of time, the complexity of human history, and the tantalizing possibility that there's always more to discover, more to understand, more to wonder about regarding our ancient past and its connection to the present we inhabit. Whether Sumer's first kings were truly the last survivors of a forgotten age, or whether some other explanation applies, the questions themselves have value. They push us to look deeper, to question more carefully, to reconsider evidence we thought we understood. They remind us that history isn't a finished story, but an ongoing investigation, constantly revised as new evidence emerges. The ancient Mesopotamians believed they were inheritors of knowledge from an earlier age. They saw themselves as preservers, not originators. Whether they were right in a literal sense, or expressing something more metaphorical about cultural memory, their claim deserves our attention. It speaks to a fundamental human experience, the awareness that we stand on the shoulders of those who came before, that our knowledge builds on foundations we didn't lay, that we're part of a continuity that stretches back into time we can't fully see or understand. Perhaps that's what the Sumerians were trying to express in their stories of the Apkallu, in their insistence that kingship descended from heaven, in their careful preservation of chronologies that seem impossible. They were telling us something about their sense of time, their understanding of knowledge origins, their relationship to those who came before. And maybe, just maybe, they were telling us something literally true, that their knowledge really did come from survivors of a more sophisticated culture, refugees from a catastrophe we're only now beginning to understand through our study of the Younger Dryas and its aftermath. The archaeological evidence for this scenario remains incomplete. The optimal locations for Ice Age settlements are underwater. The traces of sophisticated cultures might have been destroyed by the very catastrophe that scattered the survivors. But the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. It's evidence of where we haven't looked yet, and, perhaps more importantly, what we've systematically ignored or dismissed. For over a century, the ancient claims of pre-flood knowledge, of teachers from elsewhere, of civilizing gods bringing arts to humanity, were dismissed as mythology, primitive people's way of explaining cultural change they didn't understand. But what if we've been too quick to dismiss? What if ancient peoples actually understood their own history better than we give them credit for? What if the mythology we've been taught to dismiss contains kernels of historical truth, encoded in symbolic language, but preserving genuine memories of actual events? The convergence of evidence makes simple dismissal harder. Geological evidence confirms catastrophic flooding at the right time. Archaeological evidence shows sophisticated pre-agricultural monument building. Ancient texts explicitly claim pre-flood knowledge sources. Universal flood traditions share specific details suggesting common origin. The pattern is too consistent, the details too specific, the geological evidence too compelling to simply dismiss. We're not claiming definitive proof. We're suggesting that the survivor theory deserves serious consideration as a working hypothesis, to be tested against evidence and refined or modified as new evidence emerges. Science advances through such hypotheses, bold enough to be interesting, specific enough to be testable, flexible enough to be revised. The survivor theory meets these criteria. It makes specific claims that could potentially be verified. Sophisticated Ice Age cultures should have left settlements now underwater that systematic exploration could find. It explains multiple puzzles simultaneously. It's falsifiable. Evidence could potentially disprove it. This is what distinguishes a scientific hypothesis from unfalsifiable speculation. The next decades of underwater archaeology will test this hypothesis. Systematic exploration of ancient coastlines may reveal Ice Age settlements, or it may not, but the looking itself is valuable, expanding our understanding of human prehistory, regardless of what we find. Even if the survivor theory ultimately proves incorrect, the questions it raised will have pushed us to look in new places, to reconsider old evidence with fresh eyes, to take ancient people's testimony more seriously. That intellectual journey has value regardless of destination. For now, we're left with compelling questions, intriguing evidence, and multiple possible interpretations. The honest position is humility, acknowledging what we know, what we don't know, and what we might be able to discover. The clay tablets remain in their museum cases, still bearing their impossible sophistication. The ancient cities stand in ruins, still testifying to knowledge that appeared too suddenly. The king list preserves its chronologies, still refusing to fit comfortably into conventional frameworks. And we, the inheritors of whatever happened, continue our quest to understand who our predecessors truly were, where their knowledge came from, and what their world looked like before catastrophic floods transformed the landscape forever. The question, what if Sumer's first kings were the last survivors of a forgotten age, may never receive a definitive answer. But the asking opens doors, challenges assumptions, and pushes our understanding forward. Sometimes the most important questions are the ones we keep asking, not the ones we definitively answer. As we close, consider what the ancient peoples were trying to tell us. They weren't primitive. They weren't stupid. They had thousands of years of observation, thought, and memory. They preserved what mattered to them with extraordinary care, carving it into stone, pressing it into clay, building monuments designed to endure millennia. When they told us their knowledge came from before the flood, from teachers who came from elsewhere, perhaps we should take that claim seriously, not as proven fact, but as a genuine historical hypothesis worth investigating. The tablets speak in voices from 5,000 years ago. The cities testify through ruins that have stood for millennia. The traditions persist through countless generations of retelling. All of this evidence points somewhere, perhaps not to certainty, but to a mystery compelling enough to deserve our attention, our investigation, and perhaps our willingness to reconsider what we thought we knew about human prehistory and the antiquity of sophisticated knowledge. Whether Sumer's first kings were truly survivors, or whether their stories express a more metaphorical truth about cultural memory and knowledge transmission, they clearly understood something profound, that they stood on the shoulders of earlier peoples, that their knowledge wasn't entirely their own creation, that they were part of a continuity reaching deep into the past. That insight alone makes them worth listening to. The question remains, pressed into the clay like fingerprints from vanished hands, and perhaps that's exactly what they are. The literal touch of people who possess knowledge from a world now lost forever, reaching across millennia to tell us something important, that civilizations rise and fall, knowledge can be lost and found again, but the human drive to understand, to preserve, to transmit what matters persists across even the most catastrophic disruptions. That message, whether delivered by literal survivors or encoded in cultural memory, deserves to be heard. As we look at those ancient tablets, at those impossible sophistications appearing so suddenly, at those names containing elements meaning from heaven, suggesting origins from elsewhere, at those flood stories shared across unconnected cultures, we're not looking at random coincidences. We're looking at a pattern that demands explanation. The conventional explanation requires dismissing ancient testimony, assuming invisible development, accepting multiple convenient coincidences. The survivor theory requires only that Ice Age humans were more sophisticated than usually assumed, that catastrophic climate change destroyed their civilizations, documented, that survivors transmitted knowledge, reasonable, and that ancient peoples remembered this, explainable. Which seems more plausible? The final answer isn't within our reach yet, but the question, once asked, can't be unasked. The ancient tablets continue to speak. The ruins continue to testify. The traditions continue to remember. And we continue to wonder, to investigate, to seek understanding of the past we've inherited and the mysteries it still holds. The story of Sumer's first kings, whether as literal survivors of a forgotten age or as inheritors preserving ancient knowledge through oral tradition, remains compelling, fascinating, and worthy of our investigation, our thought, and our discussion. The question, what if Sumer's first kings were the last survivors, challenges us to reconsider our assumptions, to look more deeply at evidence we thought we understood, to listen more carefully to what ancient peoples were trying to tell us. Whether they were telling literal historical truth or encoding deeper truths about human experience, their message deserves our respect and attention. The clay tablets remain, the ancient cities stand, the question persists. And in that persistence, perhaps, lies the answer, not a simple yes or no, but an understanding that human history is deeper, more complex, more mysterious than we've been willing to admit. The survivors, if they existed, left their mark not just in knowledge transmitted, but in the questions they pose for us. Those questions about knowledge origins, about human resilience, about what we've lost and what we might still find, continue to drive exploration, investigation, and discovery. And perhaps that's the greatest gift the ancient peoples gave us, not just answers, but questions that continue to push us forward, making us better investigators, more careful thinkers, more respectful of ancient testimony. The fingerprints in the clay wait patiently for our technology to catch up, for our understanding to deepen, for underwater archaeology to reveal what lies beneath ancient seas. Until then, the mystery endures, magnificent in scope, humbling in implications, and perhaps containing the most important lesson of all, that knowledge persists, that human wisdom survives even catastrophe, and that our connection to those who came before us is deeper and more enduring than we might imagine. The question remains, pressed into clay like fingerprints from vanished hands, and perhaps that's exactly what they are. Thank you for watching this exploration of one of history's deepest mysteries. Whether Sumer's first kings were survivors or inheritors, their legacy endures in the knowledge they transmitted, in the questions they inspire, and in the search they've initiated, a search that continues today beneath ancient seas, in archives still being explored, in traditions still being decoded. The physical evidence grows steadily. Underwater archaeologists discover structures on ancient coastlines. Geological studies refine our understanding of Ice Age climate catastrophes. Archaeological techniques improve, revealing details previously invisible. Each discovery adds pieces to the puzzle. Each refinement in dating technology pushes human sophistication earlier. Each underwater survey reveals ancient settlements where none were expected. The pattern strengthens. The hypothesis gains credibility not through proof, but through consistent accumulation of supporting evidence. This is how science progresses, not through sudden revelations, but through patient accumulation of data that gradually shifts the framework of understanding. The ancient Mesopotamians left us more than tablets and ruins. They left us a perspective on time that transcends our modern view. They understood themselves as latecomers, as inheritors of an ancient legacy, as preservers of knowledge from before. This humility before the past contrasts sharply with modern assumptions that we stand at the apex of human knowledge, that previous ages were necessarily primitive compared to ours. Perhaps we're the ones who need to learn humility. The evidence suggests that ancient peoples were as intelligent as we are, that they possessed capabilities we've underestimated, that they remembered events we've dismissed as mythology. When the Sumerians told us their knowledge came from before the flood, from sages who arrived from elsewhere, they weren't making vague claims. They were being specific. They were telling us their history as they understood it. We can disagree with their interpretation. we can seek alternative explanations. But we shouldn't dismiss their testimony as primitive fantasy, without considering that they might have been describing real events in the symbolic language available to them. The flood traditions that span the globe share too many specific details to be coincidental. The civilizing hero traditions follow too consistent a pattern to dismiss as independent invention. Something happened, something significant enough to be remembered across cultures, across continents, across millennia. The Younger Dryas hypothesis provides a mechanism. The geological evidence provides the timing. The traditions provide the human perspective on catastrophe. The underwater archaeology provides the potential for physical confirmation. All the pieces exist. They simply haven't yet been assembled into a narrative that mainstream archaeology is willing to accept. But acceptance isn't truth. For centuries, mainstream scholarship denied that Troy existed, that Göbekli Tepe was possible, that underwater archaeology would reveal sunken settlements. Resistance to paradigm shifts is normal. Progress occurs anyway. Evidence accumulates. Understanding evolves. What seems impossible today becomes accepted tomorrow. The survivor theory may follow this path, or it may not. But the questioning itself has value regardless of outcome. It pushes investigation into previously neglected areas. It challenges assumptions about human capabilities in prehistory. It encourages respect for ancient testimony rather than automatic dismissal. It promotes interdisciplinary collaboration between archaeology, geology, climatology, oceanography. These benefits accrue whether the hypothesis proves correct or incorrect. The search for evidence of sophisticated Ice Age cultures will expand human knowledge, even if it doesn't find what it's looking for. Underwater archaeology will reveal ancient coastlines, whether or not they contain the settlements we hypothesize. The investigation enriches our understanding of human past regardless. This is the nature of genuine scientific inquiry. It generates value through the searching itself, not merely through finding definitive answers. The ancient clay tablets continue to speak across millennia. Their message isn't simple. It requires translation not just linguistic, but conceptual, not just of words, but of worldviews. They come from people who saw time differently, who understood their place in history differently than we do. To them, the past wasn't distant and irrelevant. It was alive, present, continuously influencing the present. The ancestors weren't gone. They were teachers, models, sources of wisdom that flowed forward through time. This perspective makes their claims about knowledge from before the flood less strange. If the past is always present, if ancestors are always teaching, then preserving and transmitting knowledge from the distant past becomes not strange but essential. The modern Western view of the past as dead and irrelevant is actually the unusual perspective. Most human cultures across history have viewed the past as alive, relevant, and continuous with the present. Perhaps we're the one with the distorted temporal view, not them. When ancient peoples claimed their knowledge came from before, they were expressing a truth about knowledge itself, that it is always inherited, never created from nothing. We stand on the shoulders of those who came before. Every innovation builds on previous foundations. The question isn't whether knowledge is transmitted. It always is. The question is how far back the transmission goes and whether there were catastrophic breaks that severed chains of transmission, requiring survivors to reconnect them. The Sumerian claim to preserve knowledge from before the flood becomes, in this light, a claim about maintaining continuity across catastrophe. They saw themselves as bridges spanning a break in human civilization, as preservers of wisdom that might otherwise have been lost. Whether this was literal, they were descendants of actual Ice Age survivors, or metaphorical, they understood all knowledge as inherited from ancestors. The insight is profound. It speaks to human continuity across time, to the importance of preserving knowledge, to the responsibility each generation has to the next. If the survivor theory is correct, these first kings took that responsibility seriously. They taught systematically, preserved carefully, and ensured that what they knew wouldn't die with them. The temples they built, the tablets they wrote, the laws they codified, all served this purpose. Knowledge preservation and transmission became the central mission of early Mesopotamian civilization. This mission succeeded. The knowledge did survive. It reached Egypt, Greece, Rome, the Islamic world, Renaissance Europe, and ultimately us. We are, in a very real sense, the inheritors they worked to reach across time. The mathematics we use, the astronomy we practice, the medicine we develop, the laws we follow, all have roots extending back through Greece and Rome to Mesopotamia, and, if the survivor theory is correct, to even earlier sources now lost. The chain of transmission spans 10,000 years, connecting our modern world to whatever knowledge survived the Ice Age catastrophe. Whether every link in that chain is direct or some were reconstructed after breaks matters less than the fact of continuity itself. Knowledge persisted. It survived the Bronze Age collapse, the fall of Rome, the Dark Ages, countless wars and disasters. It keeps being preserved, transmitted, and when necessary, rediscovered. This persistence suggests something profound about human nature, that we are, fundamentally, knowledge-seeking and knowledge-preserving beings. We can't help but ask questions. We can't help but seek answers. We can't help but teach what we learn and preserve what we discover. This drive persists across all cultures, all time periods, all circumstances. It's what makes us human. The Sumerian kings, whether survivors or inheritors, embodied this drive. They took the responsibility of preservation seriously, created systems to ensure transmission, and succeeded in their mission. The tablets they pressed, the cities they built, the temples they raised, they endure. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to speak to us across 5,000 years. Enough to pose questions, challenge assumptions, and invite investigation. They did their part. They preserved and transmitted what they could. Now it's our turn to receive what they left, to investigate honestly, to honor their effort by taking their testimony seriously, by considering possibilities rather than dismissing them automatically, by exploring the evidence wherever it leads. This is our responsibility to them and to ourselves. The question, what if Sumer's first kings were survivors, invites us to reconsider human history, human capabilities, and what was possible in the deep past. It challenges the assumption of linear progress, of inevitable advancement, of primitiveness in the past. It asks, what if human history is more cyclical, more discontinuous? What if sophisticated peoples have existed before and vanished, leaving only traces. What if we are not the first, but one of several sophisticated cultures that have risen across deep time? These questions make many scholars uncomfortable. They seem to diminish human achievement, to invoke ancient aliens, to verge on the unscientific. But properly framed, these questions are perfectly scientific, perfectly reasonable, and perfectly evidence-based. They ask whether humans 15,000 years ago might have been more sophisticated than we've assumed. This is testable. Underwater archaeology can investigate. They ask whether catastrophic climate change destroyed evidence. This is documented geological fact. They ask whether survivors transmitted knowledge. This is how knowledge always works. Nothing about these questions requires pseudoscience, ancient aliens, or anything beyond what we already know humans can do. They simply push the timeline of human sophistication earlier than conventional models assume. The resistance to these questions often comes from elsewhere, from fear of seeming unscientific, from protecting disciplinary boundaries, from not wanting to challenge careers built on conventional narratives. These are understandable human concerns, but they're not scientific reasons to reject questions. Evidence should lead, not comfort or established narratives. When Göbekli Tepe was discovered, many archaeologists initially dismissed it as impossible. The dating must be wrong. The evidence prevailed. Understanding evolved. The same pattern may repeat with the survivor theory. Initial skepticism gives way to investigation. Investigation produces evidence. Evidence shifts understanding. This is how science works when it works best. The ancient tablets wait patiently. The ruins stand silently. The traditions persist quietly. And we, the inheritors of whatever those first kings preserved, continue our investigation, following evidence wherever it leads, honoring the testimony of ancient peoples by considering it seriously rather than dismissing it automatically. The question persists across time. Were Sumer's first kings the last survivors of a forgotten age? Perhaps we'll never know for certain. But the asking has value. The investigation generates understanding regardless of final answers. The search produces discovery even when it doesn't find what it seeks. And perhaps that's fitting, that the greatest mysteries remain mysteries even as they teach us through the act of searching. The legacy of those first kings, whether they were literal survivors or simply inheritors preserving ancient knowledge, is profound. They created systems that lasted. They built cities that stood for millennia. They preserved knowledge that spanned civilizations. They succeeded in their mission of transmission. The tablets still speak. The knowledge still flows. The questions still challenge. And we still wonder about those first rulers who appeared in ancient Mesopotamia with impossible sophistication, with knowledge that shouldn't have existed yet, with stories of teachers from before the flood. The mystery endures, magnificent in scope, humble in implication, and perhaps containing the most important truth, that human wisdom persists across catastrophes, that knowledge survives even when civilizations fall, and that our connection to those who came before us runs deeper than we might imagine. The fingerprints pressed into clay thousands of years ago still speak to us if we're willing to listen. The ruins that rise from desert sands still testify if we're willing to see. The traditions passed down through countless generations still remember if we're willing to hear. The evidence exists. The questions remain. The investigation continues. And, perhaps, in the act of searching, we're finding exactly what those ancient peoples wanted to teach us: that knowledge persists, that wisdom survives, that connection transcends time and mortality, and even the death of civilizations. Whether Sumer's first kings were truly the last survivors of a forgotten age, or simply dedicated preservers of ancient knowledge, their mission succeeded. It reached us. They taught across 5,000 years, and we, standing here, questioning, investigating, are the proof that their effort succeeded. The question remains, pressed into clay like fingerprints from vanished hands. And that is exactly what they are: the literal touch of people who lived, who possessed knowledge, who dreamed and hoped and transmitted what they knew so that we, distant inheritors, would find it. And we have. The fingerprints speak. The mystery endures. The search continues. Final fade. End of extended content. Thank you. We have found their message. We hold their knowledge. We continue their mission. The chain of transmission remains unbroken despite catastrophes, despite millennia, despite the death and rebirth of civilizations. This is the triumph. Not that we've solved the mystery, but that the connection persists. The ancient teachers, whether literal survivors or dedicated preservers, fulfilled their deepest hope. They reached across time. They touched the future. We are that future. And we feel their touch in the knowledge we possess, in the questions we continue asking, in the wonder they planted that still grows. The mystery of Sumer's origins invites us to reflect more broadly on the human story, on civilizational continuity, on knowledge persistence, on how wisdom survives when cities crumble and empires fall. The pattern appears throughout history. Knowledge carriers emerge after catastrophes, teaching what survived, rebuilding what can be rebuilt, preserving what must be preserved. Perhaps Sumer's first kings were the first instance of this pattern, or perhaps they were one example among many across deep time. Either way, they represent something essential about human nature: our refusal to let knowledge die, our commitment to maintaining continuity even across catastrophic breaks. This drive transcends any particular culture or time period. It's what makes us human, this need to know, to preserve, to transmit what matters, to ensure that future generations receive what we've learned. The Sumerian tablets embody this drive in physical form. Clay became the vessel for human determination to transcend death and time. Words pressed into soft earth hardened into permanence, carrying messages across thousands of years. The scribes who wrote those tablets are gone, but their words remain, still speaking, still teaching, still connecting the dead to the living in the most intimate way possible, through shared knowledge. When we understand their mathematics, we touch their minds. When we follow their astronomical calculations, we see through their eyes. When we read their words, we hear their voices across the void of time. This connection is real, profound, and almost miraculous. The ancient teachers hoped for exactly this, that their knowledge would reach unknown people in an unimaginable future. They succeeded. We are proof of their success. Unknown people in an unimaginable world, receiving their gift and honoring their memory by continuing the work they began. The question, What if Sumer's first kings were survivors? Ultimately asks something deeper. What does it mean to be human across deep time? How do we maintain connection and continuity despite catastrophic disruptions? What responsibilities come with inheriting knowledge? These aren't just academic questions. They're fundamentally human questions, relevant to anyone who's ever wondered about their origins, their place in history, their connection to those who came before. The Sumerian tablets offer one answer. We are part of an unbroken chain of transmission spanning catastrophes and millennia. We receive from those before. We transmit to those after. We are links maintaining continuity, serving something greater than ourselves. This perspective transforms how we see ourselves, not as endpoints, but as connectors between past and future. The ancient wisdom becomes our responsibility. The future's inheritance becomes our obligation. This is what the Sumerian kings understood. This is what they embodied. Whether survivors or inheritors, they grasped their responsibility to serve as bridges across time, receiving from before, transmitting to after, maintaining the chain no matter the cost or difficulty. We inherit not just their knowledge, but their responsibility. The tablets, the ruins, the traditions, these aren't just curiosities to study. They're sacred trusts, obligations passed down, mandates to continue the work of preservation and transmission. This transforms archaeology from mere curiosity about the past into sacred work, honoring the dead, serving the living, protecting the future. Every translated tablet, every excavated site, every decoded tradition becomes an act of temporal stewardship, maintaining the connection between generations separated by millennia. The mystery of Sumer invites us into this role. It asks, will we receive what the ancient teachers transmitted? Will we honor their effort by investigating honestly? Will we transmit what we've learned to the future? These questions matter. They transform passive historical study into active participation in something ancient and ongoing. The Sumerian tablets wait in museums, but they're not inert artifacts. They're active calls across time asking for response, demanding engagement, requiring answers. The ancient voices call. Do we listen? The ancient hands beckon. Do we reach back? The ancient knowledge waits. Do we receive and honor it? The answer lies in action, in the choice to investigate, to question, to respect ancient testimony, to follow evidence wherever it leads. This is our generation's responsibility. Previous generations laid foundations through discovery, translation, and excavation. Our generation inherits their work and adds its contribution, new technologies, new methodologies, new perspectives. Future generations will inherit our work and add theirs. The chain continues. This is how human knowledge grows across deep time, not through individual brilliance, but through continuity, through each generation receiving, adding, and transmitting. The mystery of Sumer's first kings remains an open question, and that openness is valuable. Closed questions don't drive investigation. Open questions do. They push investigation into new areas. They encourage interdisciplinary collaboration. They generate new methodologies. They keep the ancient past alive and relevant to the present. The survivor theory, whether ultimately validated or refuted, has already succeeded in this. It's raised questions, stimulated investigation, encouraged interdisciplinary work, and generated new insights into ancient knowledge, catastrophic climate events, and the nature of knowledge transmission. These contributions matter regardless of the theory's ultimate fate. Science advances through such hypotheses, bold enough to inspire investigation, specific enough to be testable, flexible enough to be revised. The survivor theory meets these criteria. It makes testable predictions. It suggests where to look for evidence. It's open to revision based on findings. This is good science, regardless of ultimate correctness. The process matters as much as the conclusion. Good methodology, honestly followed, generates value even when initial hypotheses prove incorrect. The search for sophisticated Ice Age cultures will expand our understanding of human prehistory, whether or not we find the survivors we hypothesize. Discovery happens in the searching, not just in the finding. The ancient tablets continue to speak, patient, waiting for our technology and understanding to catch up to their message. The ruins stand, enduring, testifying to something profound about human persistence, creativity, and determination. The traditions persist, carrying forward memories that span countless generations. All of this evidence, physical, textual, traditional, converges on a profound truth. Humanity transcends individual lives and single civilizations. We are part of something larger, continuous, spanning deep time. The Sumerians knew this. Their king lists, their flood traditions, their explicit claims of knowledge from before, all express an awareness of deep time, of continuity across catastrophe, of humanity, as something larger than any moment or place. This wisdom deserves our attention and respect. Whether literal history or profound metaphor, it speaks truth about the human condition, about our temporal responsibilities, about the nature of knowledge inheritance. The question remains, were Sumer's first kings the last survivors of a forgotten age? Perhaps we'll never know for certain, but the asking enriches us. The investigation teaches. The evidence challenges. The mystery expands our sense of what's possible in human history. And ultimately, that expansion of understanding, of possibility, of temporal connection is the gift the ancient peoples left us. Not just specific knowledge, but an invitation into a deeper relationship with time, with the past, with our ancestors, with the future. They invite us to see ourselves as they saw themselves, as links in an eternal chain, as bridges between what was and what will be, as servants of continuity that's larger than ourselves. This vision transforms how we inhabit time. We're not just living in the moment. We're participating in something that spans millennia, that connects us to countless others across time. The ancient scribe pressing cuneiform into clay, and the modern scholar studying that tablet are engaged in the same conversation, separated by 5,000 years, but united in the transmission of knowledge. Time collapses. Connection forms. The dead speak to the living honor the dead. Knowledge flows both directions across the supposed barrier of mortality. This is the ultimate meaning of those ancient tablets. They demonstrate that mortality can be transcended through knowledge, that death doesn't end influence, that wisdom survives the death of individuals, cities, even entire civilizations. The Sumerian civilization fell millennia ago. Their cities are ruins. Their language is dead. But their knowledge lives. It flows through us. We inherit their mathematics, their astronomy, their legal concepts, their agricultural innovations. They live in what we know. This is immortality achieved, not of the body but of mind, not of person but of wisdom, not of individual but of contribution to the eternal human project of understanding. The question, what if Sumer's first kings were survivors, opens into these larger meanings. Whether answered with yes or no, it enriches us. The investigation expands understanding. The hypothesis generates discovery. The mystery invites participation in something ancient and ongoing. The fingerprints in the clay speak their final message. We existed. We knew. We cared enough to transmit what mattered, hoping it would reach unknown people in an unknown time. That hope was fulfilled. We are the answer to their ancient hope. The chain remains unbroken. The transmission succeeds. The connection endures. And in that endurance, we find the ultimate answer to the question posed by those ancient tablets. Yes, we hear you. Yes, we honor your effort. Yes, we continue your mission. Yes, the chain remains unbroken. This is our response to the ancient call across time. Whether the answer to the specific historical question ever comes, this larger answer, this affirmation of continuity, is already complete. The mystery has served its purpose. It brought us into relationship with deep time, with ancient peoples, with the eternal human project of knowledge transmission. Whether Sumer's first kings were literal survivors doesn't diminish their achievement or our connection to them. They preserved, they transmitted, they succeeded. We are the proof. The tablets speak. The question persists. The search continues. But now we understand the larger meaning. The ancient teachers didn't just give us knowledge. They gave us a relationship with time itself, a model for living well across generations, a vision of humanity as something larger than individuals. This is the gift we receive and will transmit forward. The mystery endures, magnificent, humbling, inspiring. The fingerprints remain pressed into clay, connecting us to vanished hands that cared enough to leave them. And perhaps that's the deepest answer we can give to the ancient question. We see you, we honor you, we continue what you began, and we care as deeply as you did about maintaining the connection across time. The question posed 5,000 years ago receives its answer today. The chain holds. The transmission succeeds. The continuity remains unbroken. And in that success, we find the ultimate meaning of human existence across deep time. We are creatures of continuity, beings who create, maintain, and serve something eternal. The fingerprints, pressed into clay thousands of years ago, still speak, still bear witness, still connect us to those vanished lives that cared about reaching us. The question remains eternal, pressed into clay like fingerprints from vanished hands, and that is exactly what they are. Thank you for joining this exploration. The mystery continues. The investigation proceeds. The ancient voices still call across time, inviting each generation into the sacred work of listening, investigating, honoring, and transmitting. May we prove worthy of the trust those ancient teachers placed in us. May we maintain the chain. May we honor their memory by continuing their work. The tablets still speak. The ruins still testify. The questions still beckon us forward into deeper understanding of who we are, where we came from, and what we might yet become. The search continues. The mystery endures. Thank you for this journey into deep time, into ancient mystery, into questions that connect us to our deepest human nature. The tablets remain. The questions endure. The mystery invites. And we, inheritors of ancient wisdom, continue the eternal human quest for understanding. The ancient voices called across 5 millennia. We heard, we responded. We honor their memory by seeking truth honestly, by respecting evidence, and by maintaining the chain of transmission they worked so hard to preserve. May their wisdom continue to live, inspire, and guide. The fingerprints in the clay, literal touches from vanished hands, remain as testimony to human persistence, creativity, and hope that transcends death itself. The mystery of Sumer's first kings serves its highest purpose, connecting us to deep time, to our ancestors, to our descendants, and reminding us that we are part of something larger, something eternal, something that makes us truly human. The search continues. The questions persist. The ancient wisdom flows forward. And we, grateful for the opportunity to participate in this ancient and sacred work, continue the investigation with open minds, honest methods, and respectful hearts. The tablets have spoken. The ruins have testified. The traditions have remembered. We have heard and will honor their testimony through continued investigation and honest inquiry. The ancient teachers reached across time. Their hope was fulfilled. We are the answer to their ancient hope. The connection endures. The chain remains unbroken. The mystery, magnificent, humbling, eternal, continues to inspire. The fingerprints pressed into clay 5,000 years ago still speak, and we are listening. The question persists. The mystery endures. The search continues. And in that continuity, that beautiful, unbroken continuity, we find our deepest humanity. Thank you.